Welcome to an exciting journey through one of the most pivotal moments in modern history as we dive deep into the Russo-Japanese War, a conflict that shook the foundations of empires and redrew the map of power in East Asia at the dawn of the 20th century. In this video, we travel back in time to the year 1904 to witness the clash between Japan's rising ambition and the faltering might of Tsarist Russia. How did war erupt between two nations separated by thousands of miles? Why did the Far East become the bloody battlefield between Tokyo and St. Petersburg? And what made this war a turning point, the end of one era and the beginning of another in international relations? We'll explore the historical background that paved the way to war, the decisive events that unfolded from sea to land, and the major transformations that resulted, not just for Russia and Japan, but for the global balance of power as a whole. If you're passionate about history and analyzing the rise and fall of empires, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. The Russo-Japanese War stands as one of the most significant military conflicts of the early 20th century, not only because of its outcomes on the battlefield, but also due to its far-reaching strategic consequences that altered the balance of power in Asia and influenced the course of global history. This war erupted between the Tsarist Russian Empire and the rising Japanese Empire, marking the first time in modern history that a European army was defeated by an Asian power. The shock of this outcome reshaped Western perceptions of the East. The seeds of the conflict began to take root in the latter half of the 19th century, during a critical period of global transformation. In the 1860s, Japan emerged from its long isolation after being forced to open its ports by American ships led by Commodore Perry in 1853. This event triggered a domestic shock that led Japan's leadership to launch what became known as the Meiji Reforms, a sweeping modernization effort that transformed Japan from a closed feudal society into a modern state with a standing army and advanced industry. By the late 1870s, Japan began to view its surrounding region, particularly the Korean Peninsula and Manchuria in northern China, as vital to its economic and military security. Meanwhile, Tsarist Russia under Nicholas II was pursuing a policy of expansion into the Far East. Russia saw Manchuria and Korea as strategic gateways to fulfill its long-held dream of reaching warm water ports on the Pacific Ocean, where its navy could operate freely, unhindered by the harsh climates that paralyzed northern ports. To that end, Russia began constructing the Trans-Siberian Railway in the 1890s, a massive project that linked Moscow to the Pacific coast. However, the railway was not completed until much later and remained logistically fragile due to its length and the incomplete nature of some sections. Amid this rivalry, war broke out between China and Japan in 1894 over influence in Korea. Japan swiftly defeated Chinese forces, resulting in the Treaty of Shimonoseki, which granted Japan rights in Korea and ceded the Liaoyang Peninsula and the strategic Port Arthur. However, a sudden intervention by three European powers, Russia, Germany, and France, known as the Triple Intervention, forced Japan to withdraw from Liaoyang. This event left a deep sense of bitterness and humiliation in the Japanese national psyche. Worse still, Russia, after forcing Japan's retreat, moved in to fill the void itself by securing long-term concessions from China in the same region and building a naval base in Port Arthur. To Japan, this appeared as a betrayal and a political hijacking of its rightful gains. Russian influence didn't stop there. It extended further into Manchuria, which had been effectively under Russian occupation since the Boxer Rebellion of 1900. When foreign powers intervened to suppress the anti-foreigner uprising in China. Though Russia pledged to withdraw, its troops remained in the region, building military and economic infrastructure that signaled intentions to stay. Korea became a direct arena of conflict. Japan sought to establish it as part of its sphere of influence, while Russia considered it essential to its southern security. In the early 20th century, Japan attempted to negotiate with Russia, proposing a settlement in which Japan would recognize Russian control over Manchuria in exchange for Russian acknowledgement of Japanese dominance in Korea. Russia, however, dismissed the proposal, either underestimating Japan or stalling to gain time until its military preparations in the East were complete. Indeed, Russia adopted a strategy of procrastination, not expecting that Japan, watching closely and warily, would soon run out of patience. Amid mounting competition and mutual suspicion, Japan realized that waiting for a favorable Russian response was no longer viable, especially given Russia's growing military presence in Manchuria and its continued stalling on withdrawal commitments. By 1904, war seemed inevitable, not merely due to disputes over spheres of influence, but also due to a clash between two opposing philosophies of governance and strategy. Russia, with its sprawling empire and Eurocentric confidence, and Japan, a rising power determined to prove itself equal to the world's great empires. The spark of the Russo-Japanese War was ignited at the peak of tensions on February 8, 1904, when the Japanese Navy launched a surprise attack on the Russian fleet anchored at Port Arthur, without a formal declaration of war. This preemptive strike reflected Japan's strategic doctrine of resolving the conflict swiftly on the battlefield before Russia could complete its military buildup in the East. Although Japan knew Russia had superior manpower and resources, it relied on its superior organization, mobility, and shorter supply lines. The war began with a nighttime torpedo attack by Japanese destroyers on Russian ships in the harbor. Several key vessels, including the battleships Cesarevich and Retvizin, were damaged, throwing the Russian Navy into disarray. Though the attack did not annihilate the fleet, it severely limited Russian naval mobility and handed Japan an early advantage at sea. In the following days, Japan escalated its naval operations, gradually imposing a blockade on Port Arthur, while simultaneously deploying ground troops to Manchuria. On land, Japanese forces landed on the Liaoyang Peninsula and steadily advanced toward Russian positions, benefiting from detailed knowledge of the terrain and strong logistical planning. The Battle of the Yalu River was the first major land engagement, where Japan demonstrated exceptional field capability and successfully drove the Russians from their positions, clearing a path northward. This was followed by a series of brutal battles, most notably the Battle of Liaoyang in the summer of 1904. There, roughly 130,000 soldiers from both sides clashed in one of the largest battles of the war. The Russians suffered heavy losses and were forced to retreat north, allowing Japan to seize new strategic positions. While the ground war raged, Japan tightened its grip on Port Arthur, which housed the bulk of Russia's Pacific Fleet. The siege lasted several months, during which the Japanese employed every available means of warfare: artillery bombardments, trench assaults, and tunneling operations to plant mines under Russian fortifications. The Russian defense was fierce, but Japanese leadership displayed extraordinary resolve, sacrificing tens of thousands of soldiers to capture the fortress. Finally, in December 1904, after a bitter resistance and widespread starvation among Russian troops, General Stoessel surrendered Port Arthur to Japanese forces. The fall of the port was a turning point in the war, as Russia lost its most important naval base in the east. On the northern front, Japanese forces pushed forward toward the city of Mukden, modern-day Shenyang, where a decisive battle unfolded in the spring of 1905. Lasting more than 2 weeks and involving over 600,000 troops, it became one of the largest battles in modern history up to that time. Although the battle was not conclusively decisive in the field, the Russian army retreated, exhausted and demoralized, giving Japan a major strategic edge and exposing the weaknesses of Russian war leadership. Meanwhile, Russia had dispatched its Baltic fleet on a long and arduous journey around Africa to reinforce its forces in the Far East. The voyage was plagued by mishaps and confusion, including accidental engagements and logistical failures. When the fleet finally arrived at the Tsushima Strait between Korea and Japan in May 1905, it was met by the Japanese Navy under Admiral Togo Heihachiro. In a swift and devastating naval engagement, the Japanese fleet sank most of the Russian ships and captured the rest. The victory at Tsushima was not just a naval triumph. It marked the definitive defeat of Russia and the collapse of its military prestige on the global stage. At that point, Russian public opinion grew increasingly restless about the war, and internal unrest escalated, reaching its peak with the Revolution of 1905. Tsar Nicholas II found himself forced to accept the idea of negotiation, and with the support of American mediation led by President Theodore Roosevelt, talks began in the city of Portsmouth in the United States, eventually resulting in a treaty that officially ended the war. The Russo-Japanese War effectively concluded after the Battle of Tsushima, which dealt a decisive blow to the Russian fleet and marked Japan's clear victory on the battlefield. However, military triumph did not signal the end of the road for Japan, as it was economically and militarily exhausted and feared the continuation of the war if Russia managed to regroup or gain new European support. Russia, on the other hand, was in a worse position. Not only had it been defeated militarily, but it was also facing deepening internal crises. The Russian Revolution broke out in 1905, with protests and strikes sweeping across the empire, public trust in the Tsarist regime waning, and the beginnings of an open opposition to the system taking form. In this turbulent context, U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt stepped in to act as mediator between the two sides. His intervention was not without interest. He aimed to maintain the balance of power in the Pacific and to prevent Japan from becoming overwhelmingly dominant, while also seeking to boost the United States' emerging diplomatic role on the global stage. Both parties agreed to begin negotiations in the city of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in the summer of 1905, with formal talks commencing in August that year. The negotiations were not easy. Both delegations entered with conflicting expectations. Japan, having secured a military victory, demanded major concessions, including full Russian recognition of its influence over Korea, the withdrawal of Russian troops from Manchuria, the cession of Port Arthur and the southern railway line there, and control over the southern half of Sakhalin Island. Japan even demanded financial compensation for the costs of the war. Russia, meanwhile, tried to preserve its dignity and refused to acknowledge a complete defeat, especially since it had not been forced into surrender by a total collapse on land, with its army still present in Manchuria, albeit demoralized. Over several weeks, intense negotiations unfolded. The Japanese delegation ultimately had to give up some of its demands, particularly regarding war reparations, due to internal economic pressure and fear of losing international support. As a result, on September 5, 1905, the Treaty of Portsmouth was signed. Russia recognized Korea as a Japanese sphere of influence and ceded its privileges in southern Manchuria, including the strategic port of Port Arthur and the South Manchuria Railway line. Additionally, Russia relinquished the southern half of Sakhalin Island to Japan. However, the demand for financial compensation was dropped, which sparked great disappointment in Japan and led to violent protests in Tokyo, known as the Hibiya riots. The Treaty of Portsmouth was not a complete political victory for either side, but it officially ended the war and solidified significant changes in the balance of power in East Asia. Japan emerged from the war with international recognition of its influence over the Korean peninsula, paving the way for its formal annexation in 1910. Japan's position as a great power was firmly established, making it the first modern Asian country to break the Western monopoly on imperial dominance, an achievement that inspired other colonized peoples, such as Indians, Egyptians, and Chinese, to seek models for resistance and modernization. As for Russia, it suffered a devastating blow that diminished its influence in the Far East and tarnished its global prestige. The war exposed the inefficiency of its military and administrative institutions, leading to mounting demands for political reform. Tsar Nicholas II was eventually forced to relinquish some of his powers by establishing the Duma, parliament, in an attempt to quell public anger. Although the Tsarist regime survived for a time, this defeat marked the beginning of its eventual collapse, which culminated in the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. The Treaty of Portsmouth was more than just a peace agreement. It marked a turning point in modern history. It opened the door for new powers to rise on the global stage and demonstrated that the balance of power was no longer exclusively a European domain. Sovereignty and independence, it showed, could be seized through strength and discipline, not merely through patience or submission. The war and its consequences proved that the 20th century would not be a continuation of the 19th. It would be a new era, marked by upheaval and dramatic transformations. The Russo-Japanese War was not merely a regional conflict, it was a pivotal moment in modern history. It symbolized the rise of the East and the decline of absolute Western dominance, planting the seeds of major global political shifts. Japan was the first to break the barrier of European superiority using modern methods and strict organization, thus opening the door to a new era of international relations and complex conflicts.